Hello, this is Waqar Rizvi, and you're watching Scope. Kazakhstan is hosting another round of Astana talks vis-a-vis Syria in the presence of Russian, Turkish, Iranian delegations, as well as representatives of the Syrian government and rebels. On the agenda are the formation of a constitutional committee and the Idlib stalemate. What, if anything, can be achieved for Syria by nations with their own national interests? To discuss this further, we're now joined firstly by Mr. Joost Hiltermann, who is the Program Director of the Middle East and North Africa at the Crisis Group, and he's joining us live now via Skype from Brussels. Mr. Hiltermann, thank you very much for joining us in the Scope. Just before coming on air for this recording, Mr. Hiltermann, I read the joint statement of the Iranians, the Russians, as well as the Turks after this meeting in Astana, and there is no talk about a deal on the creation of that constitutional committee. What do you make of that outcome?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your program today. It's an honor. And, you know, the political process in Syria, whether it be through the Geneva, the UN-led talks in Geneva, or the Astana process that includes Iran, Turkey, and Russia, the political progress has been very minor and very slow. And it was the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who already said about the Constitutional Committee that there is no deadline, which is an indication that they don't want to move fast on this. And so basically what it amounts to is that the Russians who are in Syria in the driver's seat don't have a sense of hurry. They want some kind of political process, but they want it on their terms. And to bring along the Turks in particular, but also the Iranians in the end, and let alone the Europeans and the Americans down the line, is going to be a very difficult process. And they want to have things on the ground play out in such a way that they increase their leverage.
But to be fair, Mr. Hiltermann, I imagine the Russians would say, listen, the Americans do have a presence on the ground, especially in the north of Syria. We know that at this point, especially with the Americans cooperating with the Kurds, especially in that region. America is involved, though, isn't it? And what then of American interests?
Well, of course, Americans are involved, but they have mainly spoiling power because they're not really involved in the political talks. They're not present in Astana, for example. So, so the Americans have leverage. That's absolutely right. They have about 2,000 to 3,000, don't know the exact number, troops on the ground in northeastern Syria, and they're there mainly to block an Iranian presence in Syria and to reduce it. And to have as leverage against any plans by the Russians to fix this war politically. Now that the Americans don't have the kind of role that they were playing earlier in Syria, but arguably they never had a major role in Syria. It's always been a minor one. The Russians, certainly since 2015, have been the dominant military party along with the Iranians.
Mr. Hiltermann, you say that I have to push you on this point because it's come up. The point about Americans not having a very large role in Syria, it can be argued, can't it, from the other side, of course, from the Syrian side and the Russian side, that the Americans are involved quite heavily in Syria and have been from day one through, of course, what they would call proxies, or at the very least their political cover or even arms deals with the very countries that are involved in Syria. At one point in time, that would include Turkey and otherwise with the other Persian Gulf sheikdoms. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to be very careful. All sides are using proxies. That is a fact. And Russians, of course, are directly involved. And the Americans too, to some extent, and the Iranians too. Everybody's involved directly, but also through proxies. So that's a given. Secondly, we have to be careful because the anti-Assad alliance, if you want to call it an alliance, but it's barely an alliance, is not just a matter of proxies. It is a matter of states coming together on the same common interest of wanting to remove the regime of Bashar al-Assad. But they often were working at cross purposes. You look at, for example, how Saudi Arabia and Qatar were both funding the insurgents in Syria, but basically in competition with each other and undermining each other. The same for Turkey. Turkey was on Qatar's side, but against Saudi Arabia. If you look at within the United States, the CIA and Pentagon were often working against each other's interests. So it's not that straightforward. And also, and if you listen to the American debate on this inside the United States a few years ago, there was a debate about why isn't America more involved in the Syria conflict? Because there were people who were calling for an American-imposed no-fly zone, for example, which never happened, and for direct aid to the rebels, which also, except for these efforts through the CIA, didn't happen. So in a way, it was quite limited. But because it's still the United States, it's a big power. You can say it was there was a lot of effort, but in the end, it all failed because look at where the insurgents have gotten. They have a last holdover in Idlib, and that's it.
Exactly, and I want to push you on that point, then, because as you well know, the Russians, the Iranians would say that Astana is succeeding where Geneva has failed, specifically when it comes to this process of peace talks, because of the fact, they would say, that the American, essentially, game plan for Syria has failed. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, there's some truth to that, yes. I'm not sure there was ever an American game plan for Syria. I mean, part of the problem is that under the Obama administration, there was no, the Obama administration didn't see a fundamental American interest in Syria. That arose only when Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State emerged in Syria with transnational agendas, because they pose a threat to states other than Syria. The original insurgents in Syria were only directed toward Bashar al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad in turn was only a threat to his own people, but not to other countries in the region. So for the United States, there wasn't an overriding interest. That interest grew over time, but they came in very late. So the Russian Iranians are right that no, it was, I think, a terrible mistake not to include Iran in the Geneva talks, because Iran was a part conflict. You cannot solve a conflict by excluding one party, a major party, from it. Astana repeats that mistake in a way because it's only 3 parties to the conflict. Well, the United States continues to have significant spoiling power, as I said.
Right.
So ideally, you would merge the Astana and Geneva processes under the guidance of the United Nations, but without any particular state's game plan. That would be the ideal way forward.
Okay, so let's talk about the other players here, because we know, as you well know as well, there was that meeting in Istanbul where Germany and France were around the table as well. Everybody tried to convince them, and by everybody I mean the Turks, the Syrians, the Russians, pardon me, and the Iranians tried to convince them to attend the Astana talks. But then Merkel and Macron said that their fine print, or their conditions, I should say, for that were to be that a UN committee should start work on rewriting the Syrian constitution. This has been something that even in this Astana process was supposed to have happened, but as I said at the beginning, did not. Why is Europe insisting on that? Why was Europe not around the table, even though the Turks certainly wanted Europe to be there in Astana?
Well, the Turks may want to, but I'm not sure that the Russians and the Iranians want Europe to be in Astana. I think what Russia wants is for Europe to pay up, and to pay for reconstruction in particular, not just humanitarian aid, but for reconstruction. They want Syria to regain strength, and they want the Europe to recognize the Bashar al-Assad regime. And the Europeans are not ready to do it. They don't want to re-legitimize a regime which caused all this problem to begin with, in their view. So, they're not very eager to be part of this if it means paying money in order to reconstitute a regime that has caused the trouble to begin with. So that is an unresolved issue, and we'll have to see where that goes. But what both sides do agree on is to have a new constitution.
All right, so Mr. Hiltermann, I wanted to ask, now that we're back, about specifically the role of Europe at this point in time. You would think, wouldn't you, Mr. Hiltermann, that when it comes to the Europeans, they would have an interest, wouldn't they, specifically when it comes to the refugee issue? And earlier you mentioned that they're not prepared at this point in time to give any legitimacy to the Assad government. But I imagine if the Europeans were looking at their own national interests, the issue of refugees showing up on their shores would take precedent, wouldn't it?
Well, it's a balancing for them, of course. They have the Europeans basically were on the side of the insurgency. They're against the Assad regime. The Assad regime is coming back. There's no question about it. For the Europeans, that's highly problematic because they see the regime as at the origin of the civil war in Syria. So they don't want to go back to that situation. They certainly don't want to re-legitimize it. They also understand that there is a serious problem with this. They have a problem at home, but there's no realistic expectation on the part of the Europeans that refugees in Europe will ever go back to Syria in any significant numbers. But there is a hope that maybe refugees currently in Lebanon and in Jordan and in Turkey may return to Syria if the situation is not just one where houses are rebuilt, but people are actually safe when they go back. And that is a huge question mark. So the Europeans at this point are not willing, from my understanding in discussions with them, are not willing to move forward on reconstruction until there is what they call a meaningful political transition firmly underway. And the Constitutional Committee is step number one, or actually the composition of the Constitutional Committee is step number one, and then the Constitution itself would be the next step.
So then I wanted to get your expert opinion on that point of view then from Europe, because I imagine that if reconstruction were to begin and if some semblance of stability were to return to Syria, and as you've said, the Assad government is here to stay for the moment, shouldn't Europe just accept those circumstances at this point in the interests of bringing some semblance of stability back to the country?
That would be a logical argument, except that from the European perspective, they see Assad as being constitutionally incapable of bringing stability back to Syria because of the polarization that happened through the war. That's why whenever a conflict ends, there ought to be some kind of political transition, if the situation allows it, in order to lower the emotions and to give all sides in the conflict that are still standing also a role in the future of the country. So some kind of compromise. Now, that doesn't mean, because clearly there's a winner in this conflict, and everybody recognizes that. Yeah. So that doesn't mean that the Assad government should suddenly just give up because clearly they won. That wouldn't be logical. At the same time, what the Europeans are seeking is enough of a reform of the current so that it will not oppress again the people as it did before 2011, which gave rise to the protests and then the insurgency and the civil war in the first place.
Okay, so that's a fair point, but I wanted to put this to you as well. As you said, of course, the Syria situation is quite complex. So one of the complexities here is also the atrocities committed by the other side, by what we would call the opposition or rebels. We've just recently, as you well know, there's a report by the Syrian government saying that rebels or militants, or however we want to term them, have used chemical weapons in an attack apparently on Aleppo, I believe it was. A lot hasn't been made of that, and that again, it goes back to an argument that the Iranians, the Russians, and the Syrians make, that there are double standards when it comes to such attacks. Why isn't there uproar if the rebels use chemical weapons? How do you respond to that, and how do you see Europe and the West's role in general in that very complex situation as well?
So, well, first of all, there are a couple of points. One is the use of chemical weapons is a very serious war crime. And so it needs to be fully investigated. And I would hope that the Organization for the Prohibition of chemical weapons will investigate these allegations as it has done in the past if they find that these allegations are credible on the face of it. I have seen no evidence yet emerging of any kind of substance that these attacks actually took place or were committed by rebels, but we saw some apparent victims of it, and so I would think that the investigation would be warranted and would get to the bottom of it. So that's one. And we also know that the Syrian regime has extensively used chemical weapons in the past and has been proven to have done so. Secondly, as you say, rebels as well as the regime have committed atrocities in this war. And both should be held accountable, and that's absolutely right. But we're also now talking about a political process moving forward. And I think also in that case, the bottom line concerns of both sides need to be taken into account.
Very well. I wanted to add another voice to this conversation. We're joined now by Professor Bassam Abu Abdullah, who is a professor of international relations at Damascus University, and he's joining us live now from the Syrian capital, Damascus. Professor Abu Abdullah, thank you for joining us here in the Scope once again. Professor Abdullah, I'm in conversation with Mr. Hiltermann as well, who is joining us live from Brussels. But Professor, I wanted to ask you specifically, what do you make of the Astana peace process, and do you think that there is a process now, political process, for peace in Syria?
Thank you very much for having me again in your programs. For Astana, there is no breakthrough in this round of talks. I think we have read that the first question was the refugees issue. The second is the Sochi agreement in Idlib. The third is constitutional committee. I don't think that there is a breakthrough, but for Idlib, I think the most important point that for Idlib that the Russian decided that the Russian and the Syrian army will respond against any kind of violation of the agreement from the terrorist organizations, especially Al-Qaeda or others. This is first. And the Russian talked about that Turkey needs more time for realizing this agreement, because the Syrian government talking that Turkey still didn't realize all requirements in Sochi agreement. For the Constitutional Committee, there is no breakthrough. Still, there is differences between different parties, especially that Mr. Dmitry is trying to controlling this committee through the third part of this committee, the civil society members, and the Syrian government is not accepting with any intervention from any international state or party or either United Nations, because we are considering that the Syrian constitution is internal affair of the Syrian people.
Okay, let me put that point, Professor. Professor, you just made a very good point there about the fact that we're only going to talk about the Syrian constitution, and Syria only wants its constitution to be respected. I just wanted to firstly, of course, say goodbye to Mr. Hiltermann, who had been speaking to us live from Brussels. We, of course, appreciate the insight that he provided us. I know that he had to go right now. Professor Abdullah, I wanted to go back to you and ask you, when you talk about the constitution of Syria, at this point in time, the West, as well as everybody else, says the constitution of Syria is what is the problem to begin with. The fact is that the opposition wants the constitution to be rewritten completely, so there are guarantees in it vis-a-vis human rights and other such issues. How do you respond to that, Professor? Professor Abdullah, can you hear me?
Yes. The question for me?
Yes, it was for you, yes. How do you think Syria, and how would you respond to the fact that everybody else around the world says the constitution needs to be rewritten?
First of all, the differences is in different points. First of all, I think the constitution, Syrian constitution, or either Pakistani constitution or Indian or any other constitution, it's absolutely internal Syrian affairs. The international players can help, can facilitate things, but they have no right to interfere in the constitution, because from our experiences in the region, we know that in Iraq, the American occupation wrote the constitution in Iraq, and still they have problems in every step in many articles on this constitution. Secondly, I think that after this war, 8 years now, the Syrian people will not accept from American or the Western states to interfere in the constitution, because they are thinking that they can achieve their goals through a constitution where they failed through terrorism. So this is very sensitive question for Syrian government, for Syrian people. And I think the Constitution Committee is not to rewrite or to make a review for the Constitution, not to rewrite or another.
But Professor, I have to come in, Professor, because everybody would say, or many people would say, that the Constitution right now favors President Bashar al-Assad. Because this is a system that him, and this is a constitution that was brought into place that gives favor to him. How do you respond to that?
I am advising anyone to read the Syrian Constitution 2012. I think the French president have more authorities, more than President Bashar al-Assad in the French Constitution. So it's only they are speaking about reasons. I don't think it's logically that America or France or Britain or any other international player interested in the Syrian constitution more than Syrians themselves. So we should be fair. It's a very sensitive question, because the constitution is not only articles. Constitution, it's a identity of the people, history, heritage, culture. So it's identity of the nation. It's not only that we can write the constitution article by article. So the Syrian government is want to review the constitution of 2012 and getting suggestions from the Constitutional Committee. Then this committee will not decide. The final decision is in the hands of the Syrian people through referendum.
Okay, so Professor, Professor, one of the things that's important to mention here is that, as you know, there was a meeting in Istanbul in which Turkey invited Germany and France as well to discuss the situation in Syria, and Turkey wanted Germany and France to be part of the Astana meeting as well, but they refused, because they said until there is not a UN committee on the constitution of Syria, that they will not attend the talks. So right now, it seems, Professor, that there is a stalemate. And do you think that the Syrian government is willing to then compromise on this issue?
The compromise, the question that who will be the majority member of the Constitution Committee should be from the side of the government. It's reflecting the reality on the ground, first. Secondly, we should be fair between real national opposition and between opposition who are getting support from intelligence services of Western countries or from the Gulf states. So I don't think that they are interested of that. The other point, that the constitution is very sensitive question, and it's a red line for Syrian government and for Syrian people. It should be right by the hands of the Syrians only, not by the hands of any other party in the world.
Okay, so one other question that comes up then, Professor Abdallah, as you well know, is that question of reconstruction. Russia right now is saying that reconstruction should begin in Syria, but the West and the opposition are saying reconstruction should not begin right now. What is your opinion on that?
First of all, the reconstruction is already started in first steps. And the plan of the Syrian government is depending on ourselves first, our allies secondly. The third, we will not looking for the Western support. But they want these cards to pressure on the Syrian government and to use as a political cards in their pressure on the Syrian government. We can notice that in the northeast of Syria, where is the oil and a lot of resources of Syria, where is American controlling that area, because they want to prevent the Syrian government from getting any new resources. Anyway, we will not give the West this opportunity, and we are not going to the World Bank or any other international instruments of the United States and the West. Anyway, I think the Syrian can have the main thing is stability and security, and I think reconstruction. The Syrians themselves with their friends, they can do a lot in this fight.
Okay, so let's talk about Idlib then for a moment, Professor, because that's also an important topic that was meant to have been discussed in Astana as well. For you, how do you think the situation in Idlib can be resolved?
The situation where?
In Idlib.
In Idlib.
Yes.
In Idlib, first of all, I think to explain through your TV, and which is important for part of the public opinion in Pakistan or in Asia in general, that in Idlib there are 15,000 terrorists from Al-Qaeda, what they call it, al-Nusra. And I think the extremism is, to fight against extremism and terrorism is now international in the first priority of the international agenda. But the problem now that we will give more time to Turkey. If Turkey will not succeed to stop these terrorists and to terminate these terrorists from acting in Syria, I think we will see the military operation. The second factor, which is important, that the civilian atmosphere in Idlib is changed a lot. The people is looking for freeing from this terrorist organization, because every day we are seeing that there is a confrontation between these groups from al-Nusra or other groups. So the situation is not easy there, but I think at the end of the day, the target of the Sochi agreement is to liberate this province and to return it to the Syrian government.
But to be fair, Professor, you talked about the fact that people in Idlib are not happy there. But I need to push you on this one, and I'll let you respond, of course. Many people, Professor, would say that these people are in fact afraid of living under Bashar al-Assad's government, because they say that they were tortured and they were kicked out of their homes by the Assad government and Assad's forces. How do you respond to that?
I don't think that the question with the President with Assad government. This is a Syrian government, first of all. It's not Assad government. This is a Syrian government, is first. Secondly, I don't think that the people in Idlib looking to live under the al-Nusra or al-Qaeda front. I know the situation. I am speaking depending on information from inside the Idlib. We have our people there. We have a lot of friends there, and we know the situation. But the people cannot talk now. Besides that, there are a lot of foreigners. I don't think anyone is looking for living under this extremist organization, terrorist organization. So this is only what we are hearing from some, what they call them opposition they are living in Turkey. So I don't think that if we are speaking about reforms and the future of Syria, I think all Syrian people looking to live under a normal state, normal constitution, and in a independent state.
Okay. Professor, let me add, but with your permission, let me add another voice to this conversation. We're also joined now by Mr. Dmitry Babich, who is a journalist, and he is joining us live now from the Russian capital, Moscow, via Skype. Dmitry, thank you for joining us in the scope. Dmitry, I wanted to get your point of view about this joint communique. I'm not sure if you were able to read it or not, that just came out of Astana. There is no deal right now, Dmitry, on the creation of a committee regarding the constitution. Why is that, do you think?
Well, because it's a very difficult negotiation, and I agree with our guest, Waqar Rizvi, that basically most of Syrians do not want to live under Islamist rule, under the organizations like Al-Qaeda or like Jabhat al-Nusra. But also there are big disagreements on what the future constitution of Syria will be. And it's normal. What Russia is pushing for is not just a status quo, that Syria would remain just like it has been before 2011. That is impossible. Even though Syria before 2011 looks like paradise now compared to what we have now, with whole cities destroyed and with lots of people driven out of the country. So it's going to be a long road, but certainly I hope that the centrist forces, the moderate opposition, and the Syrian government will agree to some kind of a middle solution that will allow Syria to reconstruct itself, even though it's already very bad that the United States and the European government, the European Union, simply refused to participate in the reconstruction of Syria. They
okay, so Dmitry, if I may push you on that point, because an earlier guest mentioned something which I wanted to put to you, and that is what the Russian interests are in Syria. Because, we talk about the Western interests in Syria, but what are the Russian interests in Syria right now, do you think?
Well, the main interest is for Syria not to become a nest for Islamist terrorists of the Sunni direction. People who would like to rebuild the so-called Islamic Caliphate in the borders of the 8th century. Let me remind our listeners that parts of the Russian Federation, what is now Russian Federation, they were parts of this Islamic Caliphate. There are Muslims living there, but they are Russian Muslims. We treat them as Russian citizens. A lot of them became rich and prosperous in Russia. So, of course, Russia is not interested in the so-called Islamic State or other radical organizations operating from Syria. So this is Russia's priority number one. Priority number two is for Syrians to elect their own government, probably a new government, which would be friendly towards Russia, which would pursue economic cooperation with both Russia and the West. Let me remind you that Bashar al-Assad, before 2011, when he was the president, undisputed president, he directed most of Syrian trade to the European Union. So to say that somehow, Bashar al-Assad was pro-Russian and he was anti-European, this is simply not true. It was just a very
Dmitry, then why then did the Russians stand by what many would call a dictator such as Bashar al-Assad?
Well, the question is, how can you resist the terrorist organizations such as Jabhat al-Nusra or the so-called Islamic State without using weapons? I think the West is very hypocritical when it says that excessive use was forced in Syria, that the government should somehow just talk to these people. The United States used the nuclear bomb against Japan in 1945, even though the threat that Japan was posing was a lot smaller than the threat from the Islamic radicals who were occupying parts of Damascus during the Civil War. So I think it's very hypocritical on the part of the United States to call Bashar al-Assad a dictator and to openly, financially support an armed insurgency in a sovereign country, which is Syria.
But Dmitry, the Americans, I have to come in here because the Americans would respond to you, wouldn't they? And they would say that there are accusations of the Bashar al-Assad government using chemical weapons against his own people.
Let me remind you that in 2011, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons supervised the removal of all the chemical weapons from Syria. Syria had chemical weapons because it was afraid of an attack from Israel. Israel has a nuclear bomb, so it was natural for the Syrian government to keep chemical weapons to defend itself in case of an Israeli attack. So OPCW oversaw the removal of these chemical weapons. OPCW got a Nobel Peace Prize for that in 2011. So there is a much bigger evidence that chemical weapons were used in Syria by the insurgents, by the so-called Islamic State, and by other radical organizations. Again, it's very hypocritical of the United States to accuse the Syrian government, because if the United States bombed Syria in 2013, sorry, not in 2011, but in 2013, the chemical weapons were removed from Syria. If the United States bombed Syria in 2013, then the Syrian army would crumble, and the so-called Islamic State would take the chemical weapons which were then stored in Damascus. And then our problems would seem minuscule to us, because Islamists with chemical weapons, that would be a real danger for mankind.
Okay, Dmitry, we'll leave there at that. I know a busy schedule ahead, but of course we appreciate your taking your time out to speak to us here in the Scope and sharing your thoughts with us about these talks that have taken place in Astana regarding Syria. We earlier, of course, also had Professor Bassam Abdallah, Professor of International Relations from Damascus University. We, of course, appreciate the insight that he provided for us as well. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that this is a complex situation in Syria, and that at this point in time, what's come out of this joint statement in Astana, something that the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians have said is a more successful process than that of the UN-led Geneva process. What's come out in this communique is that there is no deal on this UN committee to be created vis-a-vis the constitution of the country. The Syrian government, of course, saying the constitution only needs to be reviewed. The opposition and the West saying the constitution needs to be rewritten. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation. I'll be right back after this break.